In 1931, while Al Capone was standing trial for tax evasion in a Chicago courtroom, another man named Capone was pinning a badge to his chest 300 miles away in Homer, Nebraska. James Vincenzo Capone had become Richard Hart, town marshal, respected lawman, and everything his younger brother Alfonso would never be. This is a story about two brothers who grew up in the same house, learned from the same parents, and walked out the same front door into completely different lives. One became the most notorious criminal in American history. The other spent 40 years trying to prove that blood doesn't determine destiny. It's a story about the choices that define us, the families that shape us, and what happens when love and law find themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. Most of all, it's a story about what it costs to walk away from everything you've ever known, including your own name. The Capone family lived in a cramped tenement at 95 Navy Street in Brooklyn. Gabriel and Teresa Capone had immigrated from Italy with dreams of a better life for their children. Gabriel worked as a barber. Teresa took in laundry. They had 9 children, and they loved them all with the fierce devotion that comes from understanding how easily everything can be lost. James was the eldest, born in 1892. Alfonso, who the family called Alphonse, and who the world would later call Al, came 7 years later. In those early years, James was like a second father to his younger siblings. He was responsible, serious, protective. When neighborhood kids picked on little Al, James was there to settle things quietly but firmly. Both boys were smart, both were tough, both understood that in their neighborhood, you either learned to take care of yourself or you got taken care of by someone else. But even as children, they showed different temperaments. James read everything he could get his hands on. He loved stories about cowboys and lawmen, about men who stood between civilization and chaos. He talked about going west someday, about wide-open spaces where a man could make something of himself without having to look over his shoulder. Al was more interested in the here and now. He watched the neighborhood carefully, studying how power worked, who had it, and how they kept it. He was charming when he needed to be, intimidating when charm wasn't enough. By the time he was 12, other kids were already following his lead. The break came in 1908, when James was 16. There had been an incident. Different family members would tell different versions over the years. Some said James had been arrested for a petty crime and spent a night in jail. Others said he'd simply reached the point where he couldn't watch his younger brothers heading down a path he knew led nowhere good. Whatever the specific trigger, James made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was leaving Brooklyn. He was leaving the family. He was leaving everything behind and starting over. The argument with his parents lasted for hours. Teresa Capone begged her eldest son to stay. Gabriel told him he was abandoning his responsibilities. His younger siblings watched in confusion as their big brother packed a single suitcase with everything he owned. But it was the conversation with Al that mattered most. The two brothers sat on the fire escape outside their apartment, looking out over the streets that had shaped them both. "You don't have to go," 14-year-old Al said. "Whatever happened, we can fix it." James shook his head. "It's not about fixing anything, Al. It's about becoming something different than what this place makes you. What's wrong with what we are?" James looked at his younger brother, this kid who was already showing signs of the man he would become. Smart, ambitious, willing to bend rules when it suited him. "Nothing's wrong with what we are," James said carefully. "But I want to be something else." Al didn't understand then. It would take years for him to realize that his older brother had seen the future, had seen where the family's path was leading, and had chosen to step off it before it was too late to change direction. James Capone left Brooklyn in 1908 and didn't stop traveling until he reached Nebraska. He was 17 years old, with $40 in his pocket and a determination to become someone entirely new. He started by changing his name. James Vincenzo Capone became Richard Hart. He chose Hart because it sounded American, solid, trustworthy. He chose Richard because it was the name of a character in one of the Western novels he'd loved as a boy, a lawman who always did the right thing, no matter the cost. Richard Hart found work as a farmhand, then as a store clerk, then as a railroad worker. He was quiet about his past, but people liked him. He was hardworking, honest, reliable. When someone needed help, Richard Hart was there. When there was a problem that needed solving, people naturally turned to him. In 1919, at age 27, Richard Hart was hired as the town marshal of Homer, Nebraska. It was a small job in a small town, population 800, but it was the badge he'd been working toward his entire adult life. Marshal Hart was everything a lawman should be. He was fair but firm. He knew everyone in town and treated them all with respect. When Saturday night got a little rowdy at the local saloon, Marshal Hart could calm things down without anyone getting hurt. When farmers had disputes over property lines, Marshall Hart could find solutions that left both parties satisfied. For 12 years, Richard Hart lived the life he'd chosen. He married a local woman named Kathleen. They had 4 children. He was respected, valued, part of the community in a way he'd never been in Brooklyn. But he was also living with a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. In 1931, the name Al Capone was on the front page of every newspaper in America. The tax evasion trial was headline news. Every detail of the Capone family's life was being examined by reporters hungry for any angle on the biggest crime story of the decade. One of those reporters, digging through birth records and immigration documents, discovered that America's most notorious gangster had an older brother named James, who had disappeared from Brooklyn in 1908. The reporter kept digging until he found Richard Hart, town marshal of Homer, Nebraska. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Capone's brother is small-town lawman. By Tuesday afternoon, Richard Hart's life as he'd known it was over. The reporters came first, then the curiosity seekers, then the federal agents who wanted to know what Marshall Hart might know about his brother's activities. The phone rang constantly. People camped outside his house. His children couldn't go to school without being followed by photographers. Richard Hart held a press conference on his front porch. He was 40 years old, gray at the temples, wearing the badge he'd worn with pride for 12 years. "I haven't spoken to my brother Alfonso in over 20 years, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I chose a different path than my family when I was 16 years old. I became Richard Hart because I wanted to be a man my children could be proud of. That hasn't changed." A reporter shouted a question. "Do you regret leaving your family?" Richard Hart was quiet for a long moment. "I regret that I couldn't take them with me." What the press never found out was that Richard Hart and Al Capone had been writing to each other for nearly a decade. The letters started in 1923 when Al had become powerful enough to hire people to find his missing brother. Al's first letter was simple. "James, I know where you are. I know who you've become. I'm proud of you." Richard Hart didn't respond for 6 months. When he finally did, his letter was just as brief. "I go by Richard now. I have a family. I hope you understand why I can't be part of your world." Over the years that followed, they exchanged perhaps a dozen letters. Al would write about family news, their mother's health, their sister's wedding, their brother Ralph's children. Richard would share news about his own family, his work, the quiet satisfactions of small-town life. Neither man asked the other to change. Neither man judged the other's choices. They simply maintained a thread of connection across an impossible divide. The last letter Richard received came in October 1931, while Al was in jail awaiting sentencing. "Brother," Al wrote, "I'm going away for a long time, maybe forever. I want you to know that you were right to leave when you did. You saw something coming that I couldn't see, or maybe didn't want to see. You saved yourself. I'm glad one of us was smart enough to do that." Richard Hart never had the chance to respond. Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and transferred to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary before Richard could figure out what to say. The publicity surrounding his identity cost Richard Hart his job as town marshal. The town council didn't fire him. They couldn't. He'd done nothing wrong. But they suggested it might be better for everyone if he stepped down. For the good of the community, they said. Richard Hart understood. He'd spent 23 years building a reputation, and it had been destroyed in a single newspaper headline. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of blood he couldn't change. He moved his family to a smaller town in Kansas, where he worked as a security guard, and hoped people would forget. But they didn't forget. The story followed him. The good Capone, some headlines called him. The cop and the crook, said others. His children grew up carrying the weight of their father's secret. They were proud of who he was, but ashamed of where he came from. They learned not to mention their last name too quickly when meeting new people. Richard Hart's wife Kathleen stood by him through all of it, but the stress took its toll. She aged quickly during those years, worn down by the constant scrutiny and the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. "Sometimes I wonder," Richard told her one night in 1935, "if I saved myself or just postponed the inevitable." "You saved yourself," Kathleen said firmly. "And you saved your children. That matters." In November 1939, Al Capone was released from Alcatraz, broken by prison and syphilis. The man who had once ruled Chicago was now a shell of himself, prematurely aged and mentally deteriorating. From his exile in Florida, Al thought often about his brother James, the brother who had seen the future and chosen differently, the brother who had become a lawman while Al became an outlaw. Al never tried to contact Richard again after his release. He understood that any connection to him would only cause more pain for the family his brother had worked so hard to build and protect. But he did something that Richard didn't learn about until years later. Al had one of his lawyers set up a trust fund for Richard's children's education. Anonymous, untraceable, enough to send all 4 kids to college if they wanted to go. The lawyer had strict instructions. If anyone ever asked where the money came from, he was to say it was from a family member who wanted to remain anonymous. Al Capone's final gift to his brother was the same thing he'd given him in 1908, the chance to be free of the Capone name. Richard Hart lived to be 60, dying of a heart attack in 1952. He had worked his way back to respectability, serving as a security chief for a small manufacturing company in Kansas. His children all graduated from college, thanks to the anonymous trust fund they never questioned. At Richard's funeral, his pastor spoke about a man who had chosen to define himself by his actions rather than his origins. About someone who had proven that courage isn't just about facing danger, but about facing the truth of who you want to be and having the strength to become that person. Al Capone died 5 years earlier. On January 25th, Richard Hart read about his brother's death in the newspaper, sitting at his kitchen table with his morning coffee. He didn't attend the funeral. It would have been impossible, and it would have brought the kind of attention that Al's family didn't need. But that evening, Richard Hart did something he hadn't done in 40 years. He wrote a letter to his brother. "Alfonso," he wrote, "I heard the news today. I want you to know that I forgave you long ago for the choices you made. I hope you can forgive me for the choice I made to leave. We were both just boys trying to figure out how to become men. You chose one path, I chose another. Maybe that's how it had to be. Maybe one of us had to go each direction to show that brothers can love each other even when they can't live in the same world. I'll miss knowing you're out there even if we never saw each other. You were my little brother once, before you became anything else. I'll remember that part." Richard Hart never sent the letter. It was found among his papers after his death, sealed in an envelope marked for Alfonso. His children never knew what to do with it, so they kept it, a reminder of the complicated love that can exist between brothers who chose to become strangers. The story of James Capone and Alfonso Capone is about more than just crime and punishment. It's about the moment when we all have to decide who we're going to become. For most of us, that decision doesn't involve choosing between law and lawlessness. But we all face moments when we have to choose between the easy path and the right path, between loyalty to our past and hope for our future. James Capone chose to become Richard Hart because he understood something that many people never learn, that we are not prisoners of our circumstances unless we choose to be. That the family we're born into doesn't have to determine the family we create. But his choice came at a cost. He spent 40 years carrying the weight of a secret. He lived with the knowledge that his success was built partly on his willingness to abandon people who loved him. He saved himself, but he couldn't save his brothers. Al Capone made different choices, and he paid a different price. He chose loyalty to family over personal redemption. He chose power over peace. He chose to be feared rather than respected. And in the end, he lost everything anyway. Both brothers were shaped by love. Love for family, love for ideals, love for the people they hope to become. But love isn't always enough to bridge the gaps we create between ourselves and the world. The saddest part of their story isn't the distance that separated them, but the understanding that connected them. In their letters, you can see that each brother recognized the wisdom in the other's choice, even as they remained committed to their own path. Richard Hart proved that it's possible to escape your past and build a new life based on different values. Al Capone proved that it's possible to love someone deeply while accepting that you can't be part of their world. In the end, maybe that's the best we can do for the people we love: understand their choices, respect their boundaries, and hope that somewhere, somehow they're finding the peace that eluded us all along. 2 brothers, 2 paths, 1 family forever changed by the courage to choose differently and the wisdom to love each other despite the distance those choices created.